Empires rarely die quietly. Some collapse under the weight of external invasion. Others are eroded from within by famine, dissent, or incompetence. But in Indochina, France returned after the Second World War to find an empire that no longer wanted saving and a people no longer willing to wait. In the autumn of 1945, French officers stepped back onto the docks of Saigon expecting order, loyalty, perhaps even gratitude. Instead, they walked into a city teetering on the edge of revolution, where colonial uniforms were no longer met with fear, but defiance. How did it come to this? How did France, victorious in its liberation from Nazi occupation, lose its grip so quickly in Southeast Asia? And what force lay waiting in the hills and jungles of Vietnam, ready to replace them? This is the story of a war that was never officially declared. A war between colonial memory and revolutionary fire. Between old-world generals and barefoot peasants with steel in their resolve. A war that ended not in victory, but in humiliation, and birthed a new era of global struggle. To understand why French soldiers returned to Vietnam in 1945, we must go further back into the colonial shadows of the 19th century. In 1858, at the height of European imperial expansion, France launched a military expedition into the ancient kingdom of Dar Nam, what we now know as Vietnam. By 1887, the conquest was complete. France had cobbled together a new entity, l'Union Indochinoise, fusing Cambodia, Laos, and 3 regions of Vietnam into a single administrative colony. The justification was lofty, a civilizing mission. But behind this veneer of progress lay a more brutal truth, forced labor, resource extraction, and the suffocation of native culture. French administrators imposed their language, their education system, and their laws. And while some Vietnamese elites collaborated, others quietly began to resist. Among them, a young man named Nguyen Sinh Cung. Born in a poor village in 1890, he would later take the name Ho Chi Minh. Narrator, V.O. By the early 20th century, Ho had traveled the world, washing dishes in Paris, studying politics in Moscow, and organizing workers in the United States and Britain. In 1919, he appeared at the Paris Peace Conference, pleading for self-determination for the Vietnamese people. He was ignored. Disillusioned by the hypocrisy of Western liberalism, Ho turned to communism not out of blind ideology, but because it promised what others would not: independence. He would soon help form the French Communist Party, then return to Asia to build something far more potent, a revolutionary army. But history would intervene. In 1940, while France reeled from Nazi occupation, another empire stepped into the vacuum in Indochina, Japan. By 1941, Japanese forces had seized control of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, reducing Vichy French officials to figureheads. Ho Chi Minh returned to Vietnam after 3 decades abroad. But this time, he came not only with ideas, but with a movement. Under the banner of the Viet Minh, the League for the Independence of Vietnam Ho united communists, nationalists, intellectuals, farmers, and even disaffected soldiers. His message was simple: as one in mind and strength, we shall overthrow the Japanese and the French and save our people from the boiling water and burning heat. By 1945, the Japanese regime began to falter. Allied victories in the Pacific were closing in. Sensing an opportunity, Ho's guerrillas ramped up their operations. And crucially, they made contact with a new potential ally, the United States. The OSS Office of Strategic Services quietly armed and trained Viet Minh units. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, Ho marched on Hanoi. On the 2nd of September, he stood before a jubilant crowd and declared the birth of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. His declaration echoed Thomas Jefferson's own words: "All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." American OSS agents saluted the Viet Minh flag. For a moment, it seemed the United States might support Vietnam's bid for independence. But the winds in Washington were already shifting. Narrator V.O. President Franklin Roosevelt had opposed the return of French colonial rule in Indochina. But with Roosevelt's death and the rise of Cold War tensions in Europe, priorities changed. President Harry Truman needed a strong France, not a rebellious colony. Though sympathetic to Vietnamese nationalism, he refused to deliver Ho's appeals to the State Department. The U.S. declared neutrality, but behind closed doors, it backed French sovereignty in Indochina. In Saigon, the British arrived to accept the Japanese surrender, but brought French forces with them. It was not a liberation. It was a reoccupation. The consequences were immediate and bloody. General Douglas Gracie, a British officer in charge of post-war operations in southern Vietnam, refused to acknowledge Ho Chi Minh's government. He dismissed Viet Minh representatives and banned public gatherings. French prisoners were rearmed. Japanese troops, still fully equipped, were quietly mobilized to support colonial forces. On September 23, 1945, French commandos seized the government buildings in Saigon. The Viet Minh retaliated. What began as a power struggle quickly spiraled into open warfare. French civilians were attacked. Entier district burned. British Indian troops fought in the streets of Saigon. Japanese soldiers, former occupiers, now fought side by side with the French to suppress Vietnamese nationalists. It was a strange and brutal arrangement, and it would mark the beginning of a war that no side had officially declared, but no one could stop. As the smoke cleared over Saigon, a grim question loomed. Was this merely a riot, or the opening act of a colonial war? For Ho Chi Minh and Hanoi, there was no doubt. The French were returning not as liberators, but as occupiers in a new disguise. The Viet Minh, still under-equipped and loosely coordinated, now faced a far more experienced and organized enemy backed by the remnants of a global empire and the reluctant silence of the West. But in the South, chaos reigned. Major General Gracie, charged with overseeing the transition of power, found himself governing a city on the brink of collapse. He had arrived with just over 1,000 troops. Against him stood not only the Viet Minh, but also religious militias, nationalist factions, former Japanese collaborators, and a restless, hungry population. In desperation, Gracie armed former French prisoners. He even relied on Japanese soldiers to restore order, the very same soldiers who had oppressed Indochina for years. It was a move born of necessity, but soaked in irony. One British officer later described the scene in bitter terms. They really were a band of pretty unruly cutthroats. Their method of pacifying a village was to drive through in American trucks, all guns firing at first floor level. They seldom hit anyone, but if that's how friends arrive, no wonder the Vietnamese threw them out. The French, too, were deeply divided. Some commanders hoped to negotiate with Ho Chi Minh. Others, like Admiral Georges Dargenlou, were determined to crush the Viet Minh by force. By early 1946, the British had had enough. Facing criticism at home and resistance abroad, they began to withdraw from Indochina. The French reasserted control in the south, and in the north, Ho Chi Minh made a calculated gamble. The Chinese Nationalist Army, then in control of northern Vietnam under Allied arrangements, agreed to withdraw, allowing French forces to take their place, on one condition: that the French recognize Ho's government. For a fleeting moment, compromise seemed possible. The French acknowledged the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, but only as an autonomous state within the French Union. A semantic trick. Not independence, but accommodation. Ho Chi Minh accepted the deal, but privately, he reassured his followers. I swear to you that I have not sold out our country. I have always led you on the path to freedom, and I would rather die than betray it. The peace would not last. In November 1946, a minor clash in the port city of Haiphong spiraled into catastrophe. French naval forces shelled the city. Estimates of the dead vary wildly, from 600 to over 6,000. Civilians died by the hundreds. Markets burned. Families were buried in rubble. Negotiations collapsed. Ho Chi Minh, who had worked tirelessly for compromise, now faced the stark realization: diplomacy had failed. On the night of the 19th of December, 1946, Viet Minh units launched a general uprising in Hanoi. Street fighting erupted. French troops pushed through barricaded alleys and rebel strongholds. Sniper fire echoed through the colonial boulevards. What had begun as an anti-colonial movement had now become a full-scale war. And France was not ready. Paris responded with firepower tanks, aircraft, paratroopers, and the infamous Foreign Legion. They reoccupied the Red River Delta and pushed the Viet Minh into the highlands and jungles. But the Vietnamese fighters, disorganized, poorly armed, and largely barefoot, refused to disappear. They melted into the terrain. They carried rice in bamboo tubes and dismantled machine guns across mountain passes. They built secret bases along rivers and borders. They planted traps, crude, clever, and deadly. They attacked at night, then vanished by dawn. The jungle became their ally. The village became their fortress. And slowly, painfully, the guerrilla war began. Meanwhile, the French sought a political solution to match their military one. They resurrected an old name, Bao Dari, the former emperor of Vietnam. In 1949, the French installed him as the head of a new state of Vietnam, based in Saigon. It was meant to counter Ho Chi Minh's Northern Republic. But Bao Dar was widely viewed as a puppet, a man who had collaborated with both the Japanese and the French. He commanded little loyalty. Even the United States, though desperate to support a non-communist alternative, hesitated to embrace him. That same year, everything changed. In China, the communists under Mao Zedong triumphed over the nationalists. The People's Republic of China was born and immediately recognized Ho Chi Minh's government in the north. Weapons, advisors, and strategy began flowing across the border. The Viet Minh, once a band of revolutionaries, now had access to artillery, machine guns, and professional training. They set their sights on the northeastern border, the Thao Bung Larang Sun Corridor, a string of French forts protecting the supply routes into the Red River Delta. The result was catastrophic. In the fall of 1950, the Viet Minh launched a coordinated assault. French forces tried to retreat, but were ambushed and annihilated. Entire columns were lost. Thousands died. It was France's biggest defeat since World War II. And yet, it was only the beginning. The name Vong Nguyen Giáp would soon echo through every French military briefing. A former teacher turned self-taught general, Giap was not a product of military academies. He had studied warfare not in classrooms, but in exile and revolution. His heroes were Napoleon, Mao, and the mountains of his own homeland. And now, he had just delivered France its worst colonial humiliation in decades. The destruction of the Thao Bung Long Sun Line in late 1950 shattered any illusion that the French could win a quick or easy war. 8 battalions were wiped out. Tons of equipment lost. Morale crumbled. French officers began to whisper the unthinkable, that perhaps Indochina was no longer defensible. Paris responded with desperation disguised as determination. A new man was appointed to turn the tide, General Jean de Lattre de Tassigny. Veteran of the Free French Forces, hero of World War II, de Lattre was charismatic, intelligent, and politically astute. He knew he needed more than rifles. He needed symbols. Under his command, French forces fortified the Red River Delta. The Lattre Line, a chain of bunkers, outposts, and fire bases, encircled Hanoi and the surrounding territory like a steel net. It was more than a military perimeter. It was a statement. We will not be driven out. But Giap was not intimidated. He now commanded a modernizing army, thousands of Viet Minh troops armed with Soviet and Chinese weapons. And he believed in human wave tactics, the idea that overwhelming numbers could break through superior firepower. In January 1951, he put that theory to the test. At the town of Viet Minh, north of Hanoi, Giap launched a massive assault. His forces moved in columns, supported by mortars and light artillery. They overran French forward positions and threatened to slice open the Delta's northern flank. But de Lattre was waiting. From command bunkers, he called in artillery strikes and air raids with precision. He ordered French paratroopers to counterattack. In one furious week of fighting, The French claimed over 6,000 Viet Minh dead for only 43 of their own. Giap withdrew. To French officers, it was vindication. The myth of communist invincibility had been broken. And yet, there was no triumph, no pursuit, no destruction of Giap's core forces. The Viet Minh simply faded into the jungle. Worse still, the French were running out of men. Most of the army in Indochina was not French at all, but Algerian, Moroccan, Laotian, and Vietnamese auxiliaries. The Foreign Legion, long romanticized in Western imagination, was now a patchwork of Germans, Yugoslavs, Hungarians, and even former Axis soldiers. The bulk of the fighting fell to volunteers, many of whom had no stake in the war beyond their pay. Even so, de Lattre pressed on. He launched new offensives to clear Viet Minh bases. He reorganized command structures. He lobbied Washington for more aid, but time was not on his side. In January 1952, he died of cancer, leaving behind a fragile military recovery and no clear successor. Giap, though bloodied, had learned valuable lessons. He would not repeat his mistake. No more frontal assaults. No more waves against concrete and steel. Instead, he returned to the shadows. For most of 1952, the Viet Minh avoided pitched battles. They attacked supply convoys. They assassinated local officials. They built new roads, new networks, and waited. Then, in October, they struck again. Operation Lorraine was France's answer. A massive sweep through Viet Minh territory, 300,000 troops marching deep into the northern jungles. Supply depots were seized, bridges blown, villages burned. But Giap allowed it. Then, at a narrow gorge near Chan Muang, his forces ambushed the French columns. The retreat became chaos. Paratroopers cut off. Armored vehicles bogged down. Over 1,000 men lost. For Giap, it was vindication. For France, it was déjà vu. But the most important lesson from Lorraine wasn't on the battlefield. It came in the form of a question whispered inside French command tents. What if we could turn the tables? What if we could lure the Viet Minh into attacking us on our terms where we are strongest? It was a flawed question, and it would lead to one of the most infamous battles of the 20th century. But before we arrive in the valley of Điện Biên Phủ, we must first stop at another outpost. A test case. Narrator, V.O. In late 1952, French commanders fortified a remote base in the highlands Na San. Surrounded by steep hills and valleys, it was defensible by air and equipped with artillery. General Jean Gilles, its commander, used Arison tactics, creating a defensive hedgehog of bastions that could mutually support each other. Giap took the bait. He launched a series of night assaults. His men fought with valor and were repelled by walls of fire. Over 1,500 Viet Minh killed, thousands more wounded. The French lost fewer than 500. For Paris, it was proof. Air-supported fire bases could win this war. Narrator V.O. By now, Washington was watching closely. The Cold War had arrived in Asia. The Korean War had ended in stalemate. China was communist. And in the jungles of Indochina, the United States now saw not a colonial conflict, but a front line in the battle against global communism. In 1953, General Henri Navarre arrived in Vietnam with a new directive: win battles, buy time, and find a way out. Navarre inherited a war that had already cost thousands of lives. French forces were spread thin across 800 garrisons. He needed a strategy, something that could finally force Giap into a decisive defeat. So he turned back to the Na San model. He studied the maps. He found a valley. He made a plan. And with that, the road to Điện Biên Phủ began. The Valley of Điện Biên Phủ was a name few outside Indochina had heard in 1953. Remote, nestled in the highlands near the Laotian border, it was home to little more than rice paddies and scattered villages. But in the minds of French planners, it would become the cornerstone of victory. Navarre believed that by dropping elite forces into the valley, fortifying it with artillery and tanks, and resupplying by air, the French could recreate the success of Na San on a grander scale. The idea was to bait Giap into a conventional assault one that would be crushed by superior firepower. But Điện Biên Phủ was not Na San, and Giap was no longer the same general. Narrator, V.O. On the 20th of November, 1953, French paratroopers descended from the sky. The landing was rough. Contrary to intelligence reports, Vietnamese fighters were already in the area. Some paratroopers were shot as they fell. Others were killed with bayonets before they even hit the ground. Still, within days, the French secured the valley. Engineers cleared runways. Bulldozers were dropped by parachute. An airstrip was built. Outposts were established across the surrounding ridges and named Beatrice, Gabrielle, Anne-Marie, Dominique, Huguette, Claudine, Isabelle. The French brought in everything: M24 Chaffee tanks, heavy artillery, crates of barbed wire, even a military brothel staffed by Vietnamese and Algerian women. By January 1954, over 10,000 troops manned the base. They were confident, some even cocky. Colonel Charles Perroth, commander of French artillery, declared, "No Viet Minh gun will fire 3 rounds without being destroyed." History would remember that sentence with tragic irony. Narrator, V.O. What the French failed to understand was that they had not set a trap, they had walked into one. General Giap watched the build-up at Điện Biên Phủ with cold calculation. He knew the terrain, he understood the logistics, and most of all, he understood time. While the French rushed to build their fortress in the valley, Giap prepared the hills. From behind the tree line, Vietnamese porters, men, women, even children began to build a supply network. 500 kilometers of hidden paths, dug by hand. A sea of labor carrying artillery shells, food, and heavy guns on bicycles, baskets, and backs. Entire regiments of Viet Minh troops moved silently into position. Artillery smuggled from China, some captured in Korea, was dragged up impossible slopes, concealed in caves, and camouflaged among the trees. By March, Giap had over 240 artillery pieces aimed at the French below. And the hills gave him the high ground. Narrator, V.O. The French, for all their firepower, had made a critical mistake. They built their fort on a flat, bowl-shaped valley, overlooked on all sides. Their airstrip, their lifeline, lay exposed. Their outer bastions were too far apart to support each other. And their artillery, despite Perrot's bravado, was poorly dug in and easily spotted. On the 13th of March, 1954, the sky exploded. Giap's guns opened fire not in desperation, but with surgical intent. Shells slammed into the northern outpost, Beatrice, shattering bunkers, burying men alive. French radio operators screamed for reinforcements. None came. Beatrice fell within hours. Then came Gabrielle. Then Anne-Marie. Each bastion crumbled under coordinated infantry assaults, timed with relentless artillery barrages. French troops, surrounded and under constant fire, began to dig trenches between positions like the Great War all over again. Điện Biên Phủ was becoming a 1950s Verdun. Narrator, V.O. By late March, the airstrip was no longer usable. Every French aircraft that attempted a landing was targeted by anti-aircraft fire. Wounded soldiers and supplies had to be dropped in by parachute and often fell into Viet Minh hands. Colonel Perroth, humiliated and broken, took his own life with a grenade. Meanwhile, French commanders debated 3 desperate options. Operation Condor, a ground relief column from Laos. Operation Vulture, direct American air support, possibly even with B-29 bombers. Operation Albatross, a breakout by the garrison before total encirclement. None would materialize in time. President Eisenhower, wary of a new Korea and lacking British support, declined intervention. American pilots, flying under civilian cover with the CIA-linked civil air transport, continued to drop supplies. But it was not enough. Narrator VO. As April turned to May, the French situation was desperate. Trenches were flooded. Malaria and dysentery spread. Ammunition was running low, and Giap was preparing for his final blow. His men had been digging hundreds of sapping tunnels, trenches, and bunkers, inching ever closer to the French core. By early May, the battlefield had shrunk to just 1.5 kilometers, an open-air graveyard of shattered metal and shattered men. On May 6, the Viet Minh unleashed their final assault, aided by new Chinese-supplied rocket launchers. One by one, the remaining bastions fell. By the evening of May 7, the garrison had collapsed. Out of more than 10,000 men, fewer than 100 would escape. Narrator V.O. The code word sent back to French headquarters was simple: Austerlitz, a name taken from Napoleon's most glorious victory, now laced with bitter irony. France had lost more than just a battle. It had lost the myth of its colonial permanence. The loss of Điện Biên Phủ shattered morale in Paris. Public support for the war evaporated. Newspapers called it la sale guerre, the dirty war. But the consequences were not just military. They were political, global, and irreversible. The Geneva Conference was just weeks away. And for Ho Chi Minh, victory at Điện Biên Phủ would not bring peace. It would bring division. May 8, 1954. While France commemorated 9 years since the defeat of Nazi Germany, it was forced, on that very same day, to confront its own crushing defeat in Indochina. The name Điện Biên Phủ, a once obscure mountain valley, now joined the ranks of imperial calamities. It stood beside Isandlwana, Adowa, and Caporetto, as a place where a colonial army was broken not by numbers alone, but by resolve. Over 2,300 French troops were dead, 6,000 more wounded, nearly 9,000 taken prisoner. Among them, survivors of trench warfare who would now march through the highlands into captivity under the Viet Minh. And yet, for General Giap and Ho Chi Minh, the price had been equally steep. The Viet Minh had lost as many as 30,000 fighters, many of them peasants who had never seen a city, never held a rank, but had died with rifles or bamboo spears in their hands. But their sacrifice had yielded something France could no longer ignore: a seat at the table. Narrator V.O. The Geneva Conference opened in July 1954, attended by world powers whose empires and ideologies stretched across every continent. The United States, the Soviet Union, China, Britain, and France, humiliated, but still seeking to shape the outcome. Vietnam was no longer just a colony. It had become a pawn on the Cold War chessboard. For Ho Chi Minh and his delegation, the objective was clear: full Vietnamese independence. For the French, the goal was containment of both communism and political fallout at home. And for the great powers, the goal was balance. Peace, yes, but not necessarily justice. Narrator V.O. The result was compromise without consensus. Vietnam would be divided temporarily at the 17th parallel. North of the line, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, ruled by Ho Chi Minh. South of the line, the state of Vietnam, still nominally led by Bao Dare, but with real power soon to fall into the hands of Ngo Dinh Diem, a Catholic anti-communist backed by the United States. The agreement promised national elections in 1956, supervised, peaceful, unifying, but few believed they would ever occur. China, eager to avoid provoking American intervention, had pressured Ho to accept the division. For Beijing, securing its southern border was more important than Vietnamese unification. And Moscow preferred to keep the Cold War cold. In that moment, the victors were told to wait, to retreat, to accept half a country. Narrator V.O. It was a bitter pill. Le Duan, a leading Viet Minh strategist, later recalled the moment with pain. I traveled by wagon to the south. Along the way, compatriots came out to greet me, for they thought we had won a victory. It was so painful. Many fighters in the South felt betrayed. They had fought, bled, and watched comrades die, only to be told that their revolution was on hold, that the cities they helped liberate would now be governed by men they once opposed. Some obeyed, others went underground. Still, others prepared for what they already suspected was inevitable: a second war. Narrator V.O. In Paris, the war was over, but the reckoning had only just begun. The First Indochina War had cost France nearly 79,000 soldiers, including over 15,000 North Africans. Tens of thousands more had been wounded, captured, or psychologically scarred. The financial toll was staggering. The political cost? Even greater. France's Fourth Republic was weakened, fractured, its army disillusioned, its global prestige in tatters. Within 2 years, many of the same generals and politicians who had mismanaged Indochina would turn their attention to Algeria, where another colonial war had already begun. Narrator V.O. For the Vietnamese, the war had never been simply about communism. It had been about sovereignty, dignity, and liberation. But with the country divided, the narrative shifted. The United States, now the primary foreign power in South Vietnam, no longer saw Ho Chi Minh as an independence leader, but as a Soviet proxy. The domino theory, championed by President Eisenhower, suggested that if one Asian country fell to communism, others would follow in succession. Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, even India. Containment became the new gospel, and South Vietnam, poor, fragile, and corrupt, was its altar. Narrator V.O. Ngo Dinh Diem, with American backing, began consolidating power. He sidelined Bao Dar, cracked down on religious sects and political rivals, and launched campaigns against suspected communists. His methods were authoritarian. His vision, exclusivist. To Washington, Diem was a bulwark. To many Vietnamese, he was a tyrant. The seeds of rebellion were already being sown, not by the same Viet Minh of old, but by a new generation of fighters, soon to be known by another name: the Viet Cong. Narrator V.O. The French had left, but the war had not. What had started as a colonial conflict had morphed into something far more dangerous: a struggle between superpowers, ideologies, and visions of global order. For the United States, the choice seemed clear: intervene and protect freedom, or step back and risk collapse. But Indochina was not Europe. It did not follow the rules of Cold War symmetry. It followed the rivers, jungles, and spirits of a people who had fought foreign domination for over 1,000 years. And they were not done fighting. Wars end, but not always in silence. Sometimes they leave behind echoes heard in revolutions that follow, in the soil where empires collapsed, in the memory of those who still count the missing. The First Indochina War ended in a signed agreement, but in truth, it never ended at all. Within months of the Geneva Accords, the dividing line at the 17th parallel hardened. Refugees flooded both directions. Nearly 1 million Vietnamese Catholics fled north to south, fearing religious persecution under communist rule. In reverse, communist sympathizers moved north, leaving behind families, property, even graves, in the hope of one day returning. A nation once whole, however, bruised and colonized, now split by barbed wire and ideology. But behind that divide, two very different visions for Vietnam began to take shape. Narrator V.O. In the north, Ho Chi Minh and the Workers' Party of Vietnam embarked on a nation-building campaign. Land reform, education drives, industrialization, with the help of Soviet and Chinese advisors. But the price was steep. Between 1953 and 1956, the land reform campaigns led to tens of thousands of deaths. Accusations of landlordism turned into mass denunciations. Villages were torn apart by class struggle and by fear. Ho would later admit to excesses and publicly apologize. Still, for many in the countryside, The Viet Minh were not seen as tyrants, but as the only force that had stood up to the French, the Japanese, and a century of humiliation. In their narrative, history had bent toward justice. Narrator, V.O. In the South, Ngo Dinh Diem, now president, ruled with growing paranoia. American advisors poured in. Aid money flowed through ministries and military barracks, but so too did corruption, repression, and distrust. Diem's regime banned opposition parties. Buddhist monks, a core part of the Vietnamese spiritual fabric, found themselves marginalized. Former Viet Minh were hunted down, tortured, executed, disappeared, and while the countryside simmered, Washington applauded. In a Cold War measured in binaries, Diem was our man. In Saigon, the domino kept upright. But beneath the surface, a new insurgency was germinating. Narrator, V.O. Among the shadows of the Mekong, in hamlets and hills, the Second Indochina War was taking shape. It would be called the Vietnam War by the West. But to those who fought it, it was simply the continuation. Von Nguyen Giap still led the People's Army of Vietnam. Le Duan emerged as a hardened, unrelenting strategist, convinced that peaceful reunification was a fantasy. And in the South, former Viet Minh operatives reorganized under new banners, building cells, smuggling weapons, spreading ideology. By 1959, attacks on ARVN outposts, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, began to rise. By 1960, Diem survived a coup attempt. By 1961, the United States began sending combat troops in an advisory role. And by 1964, Vietnam was burning again. Narrator, V.O. But what of France? After Điện Biên Phủ, the nation turned inward. Its Fourth Republic collapsed in political gridlock. And in its place, a man returned from the shadows, Charles de Gaulle, the same general whose appointees once sought to restore French colonial rule in Indochina, now accepted its loss as inevitable. Under his new Fifth Republic, France would fight another brutal war, this time in Algeria. And again, it would lose. By the 1960s, the French Empire was unraveling across Africa, the Middle East, and the Pacific. Indochina had been the first break in the dam. The others would follow. Narrator, V.O. So what, then, is the legacy of the First Indochina War? Was it a war of independence? A communist revolution? A Cold War proxy? Or something more ancient, a final reckoning between a fading empire and a land that had resisted foreign rule for 1,000 years? To some, it was all of these. To others, none. But in the eyes of many Vietnamese North and South, it marked the end of something irreparable. A generation of young men had gone into the hills with rifles carved from bamboo, hoping to drive out the French. They returned to find a country split in two, and a new war waiting. The revolution had delivered independence, but not unity. Narrator, V.O. In Hanoi, a statue of Ho Chi Minh watches over a city of glass towers and motorbikes. His image remains iconic, though more symbol than sovereign. In Saigon now, Ho Chi Minh City, the past lingers in colonial facades, rusted bunkers, and streets named for martyrs. But beneath the surface, the memory of the First Indochina War remains raw. Not just for the Vietnamese, but for the Algerian rifleman who died in a jungle far from home. For the legionnaire who never saw his country again. For the American pilot who dropped supplies into a war he barely understood. And for the peasant girl who carried rice through the mountains, never to return. They were all part of a war that history nearly forgot, but which shaped the fate of Southeast Asia for decades to come. Would you like me to continue? Current total, 6,874 words. You said. Yes. ChatGPT said. Legacy files. The Indochina War. 1,945, 1,954. Full documentary script, vertical bar, written in Legacy Files cinematic style. Part 7. The War That Refused to End. Word count this section. 925 vertical bar. Final total 7,799. Narrator V. O. In the end, the First Indochina War was not simply a war of soldiers. It was a war of illusions. France believed it could return to empire, that the world of 1,887 could be rebuilt atop the ashes of 1,945. Ho Chi Minh believed he could win independence and unity in one breath, that the world would allow it. The United States believed it could support colonialism without becoming colonial. And China believed that a communist Vietnam could be shaped and constrained. Each belief collapsed in fire and mud. Narrator V.O. The war left scars not only in villages and capitals, but in minds. It reshaped how revolutionaries saw the world and how empires counted their limits. It proved that guerrillas could beat tanks, that jungle trails could defeat airstrips, and that a people determined to rule themselves would not be ruled. But it also proved something darker. That power, whether colonial or communist, is never clean. That independence, when brokered by superpowers, comes with conditions. And that in war, victory rarely belongs to the dead. Narrator V.O. In a quiet cemetery near Hanoi, a grave bears the name Nguyên Giáp. He died in 2013, aged 102. His ashes lie beneath the red soil he once fought to defend. In France, there are no national monuments to the war in Indochina. No parades, only memories, buried in the minds of veterans and families and in the quiet spaces between the pages of history books. And in the United States, Điện Biên Phủ is a cautionary tale, a warning, one often ignored. Narrator V.O. Today, Vietnam is a single country once more. Its cities are growing. Its people are young. Its past complicated. The flags may have changed. The uniforms faded. But in the jungles, the villages, the river deltas, the ghosts remain. They do not ask who won. They do not care who lost. They only ask to be remembered. Narrator V.O. If this documentary moved you, if you believe stories like these deserve to be preserved with honesty, depth, and care, then join us. Subscribe to Legacy Files. Help us keep the voices of the past from falling silent. This was the story of the First Indochina War, a war that began with a declaration of independence and ended with a country cut in half, not by borders on a map, but by the weight of history